You didn't come here to fit in. You've known that since you were a child, before you had the words for it, before anyone gave you permission to say it out loud. Something in you has always been at war with the way things are, not because you're angry or broken, because you can see what no one else seems willing to look at. And that seeing has cost you almost everything. Carl Jung spent his career mapping the deep architecture of the human psyche. He cataloged archetypes, those ancient psychological blueprints that shape how people think, feel, and move through the world. Most of his colleagues studied the common ones, the caregiver, the hero, the trickster. But late in his work, Jung became fascinated by something rarer, an archetype that appeared so infrequently and in such psychologically intense individuals that he almost hesitated to document it. He found people who carried a combination of traits so unusual that they didn't fit any existing category. These were individuals who possessed the full perceptual depth of a true empath, but fused with something fiercer, something older, an energy that didn't just absorb the world's pain, but saw through its structures, and refused to participate in its lies. Jung never used the term Indigo Empath. That language came later, borrowed from people trying to name what he had already mapped. But the archetype he described matches it exactly. A consciousness that arrives already oriented toward dismantling what's false. A sensitivity so precise it functions less like emotion and more like sonar, bouncing off the hidden architecture of people and systems and returning a picture no one asked to see. An inner authority so fierce that no external power structure can override it, no matter how much pressure is applied. Today I'm going to walk you through 5 signs that you carry this archetype, according to the patterns Jung documented across decades of work. These aren't personality quirks or spiritual badges. They're specific psychological markers that appear together only in this one configuration. And if you recognize all 5 in yourself, it will explain nearly everything you've struggled to understand about your life, your relationships, and the relentless feeling that you're here for something the world hasn't caught up to yet. The first sign is that your sense of mission preceded any experience that could have created it. Most people develop a sense of purpose over time. They encounter a cause, suffer a loss, discover a passion, and gradually orient their lives around something meaningful. Purpose gets built from experience. But if you carry the Indigo Empath archetype, you arrive with the mission already installed. You didn't develop a feeling that something was wrong with the world. You were born knowing it. You didn't learn to question authority. You came in questioning it. Before school, before religion, before anyone taught you what to believe, something in you was already measuring the world against an internal standard that the world consistently failed to meet. Jung described this as archetypal possession in its healthiest form, not the destructive kind where someone is swallowed by an archetype and loses their individual identity, but a form where the archetype provides an innate orientation so strong that no amount of conditioning can fully override it. The Indigo Empath child looks at the family system, the school system, the social system, and perceives immediately that these structures are built on agreements most people never examine, rules that serve the system rather than the people inside it, hierarchies that reward compliance and punish authenticity. And this child, without anyone teaching them, knows that these structures are wrong, not morally wrong in some abstract sense, wrong in the way a dislocated bone is wrong, functionally misaligned with something the child can feel but can't yet name. This created a specific kind of childhood suffering that Jung found in nearly every person carrying this archetype. Because you can't be 5 years old, perceiving systemic dysfunction with crystal clarity, and have anyone take you seriously. You're told you're too sensitive, too intense, too difficult, too much. The very perception that defines this archetype gets pathologized before you're old enough to defend it. And the message lands hard. Something is wrong with you for seeing what you see. You should learn to stop seeing it, but you couldn't stop. That's the marker. Other sensitive children eventually learn to dampen their perception, to trade clarity for belonging. The Indigo Empath cannot. The archetype won't allow it. You could suppress it for a while, perform normalcy, pretend the structures made sense, but the perception kept bleeding through, in quiet moments, in journal entries, in the pit of your stomach every time you watched someone perform a role you could see was destroying them. The mission was there before you chose it, and no amount of punishment for carrying it could make it disappear. Jung found this particularly significant because it suggested the archetype wasn't a response to environment. It was a predisposition that environment then shaped. The Indigo Empath didn't become a system questioner because they were hurt by systems. They were hurt by systems because they were already a system questioner. The perception came first, the suffering followed. And that order matters because it means this isn't a wound you're carrying. It's a capacity you were born with that a wounded world tried to crush. The second sign is that your empathy has never been passive. Most empaths are described as absorbers. They soak up the emotional atmosphere, feel what others feel, carry the room's energy in their body. And that description might partially apply to you, but it misses something essential. Your empathy doesn't just receive information, it decodes it. When you walk into a room and feel the tension, you don't just register that tension exists, you perceive the specific lie generating it. The performance everyone is maintaining, the unspoken agreement holding the dysfunction in place. Your empathy isn't a sponge, it's a scalpel. Jung documented this distinction carefully because it's what separates the Indigo Empath from every other empathic configuration. Standard empathy is receptive. You feel what's there. Indigo empathy is penetrative. You feel what's there, and you see why it's there, and you perceive what it's protecting, and you recognize the entire architecture of avoidance that everyone in the room is unconsciously collaborating to maintain. All of this happens in seconds. It's not analysis. It's perception, as immediate and involuntary as sight. This is why your empathy has always felt confrontational, even when you weren't trying to confront anyone. You'd be sitting at the dinner table and suddenly say something that named the exact dynamic everyone was pretending didn't exist. You weren't trying to start a fight. You were just responding to what you perceived, the way someone responds to what they see. But what you perceived was invisible to everyone else. So your response seemed to come from nowhere, seemed aggressive, seemed like you were looking for problems. Jung observed that people carrying this archetype were consistently mislabeled as troublemakers, contrarians, or emotionally unstable. Because when your empathy is penetrative rather than passive, you don't just absorb dysfunction, you expose it. You become a mirror that reflects back what people are hiding. And most people aren't hiding things because they're evil. They're hiding things because they're terrified. So when you reflect their truth back to them, they experience you as a threat. Not because you're threatening, because truth is threatening to anyone who's built their life on avoiding it. This created a pattern Jung found in nearly every Indigo Empath's history, a cycle of intensity and rejection. You'd enter a group, a family, a relationship, a workplace. Your penetrative empathy would begin perceiving the hidden dynamics. Eventually, you'd name something, sometimes deliberately, sometimes without even realizing you'd done it, and the system would react. Defensiveness, hostility, exclusion. You'd be pushed out, labeled the problem, identified as the one disrupting the peace, when in reality, you were the only one perceiving what was actually disrupting the peace. You just made the invisible visible, and the system punished you for it. If this pattern has repeated throughout your life, if you keep being ejected from systems after you name what no one wants named, you're not the problem Jung would have you understand. You're the diagnostic instrument. Systems expel you because you accurately identify their dysfunction. And dysfunction, when identified, either has to be addressed or the identifier has to be removed. Most systems choose removal. That's not a reflection of your brokenness. It's a reflection of the system's unwillingness to face what you're showing them. And if this is resonating, if you're recognizing in these words the architecture of a struggle you've carried alone, then you already know that understanding yourself isn't optional for you. It's survival. Our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, each one designed to help you map the inner territory that the world has never given you language for. It's the kind of work this archetype was built for. Click below to begin, and let's continue. The third sign is that you went through a spiritual crisis long before most people even begin asking spiritual questions. Not a casual interest in meaning, not a phase of reading books about the universe. A full psychological rupture where the reality everyone else seemed comfortable in stopped making sense to you entirely. And this didn't happen in your 30s after a divorce or a career collapse. This happened early, sometimes in adolescence, sometimes in childhood, sometimes so early you can't even date it, because it feels like it was always there. Jung called this an encounter with the numinous, a moment when the psyche contacts something so vast, so beyond the ego's ability to process, that normal consciousness temporarily breaks down. For most people, this happens later in life, if it happens at all. The midlife crisis, the dark night of the soul, the moment when accumulated success fails to fill the emptiness and the real questions finally force their way through. But for the Indigo Empath, Jung found this encounter happened decades earlier, as if the archetype accelerated the individuation timeline, forcing confrontation with ultimate questions before the ego had developed sufficient defenses to avoid them. This is why so many people carrying this archetype report childhood depression, existential anxiety, or periods of what looked like withdrawal but were actually intense internal processing. You weren't depressed in the way people understood depression. You were experiencing a spiritual emergency that no one around you had the framework to recognize. You were asking questions at 8 or 12 or 15 that most people don't encounter until 40. Why are we here? What is this? Why does everyone pretend this is normal? Why can I see that it isn't? And because no one around you is asking these questions, because your parents and teachers and peers were still operating within the structures you had already seen through, you had nowhere to put the experience, no language for it, no container. So it became isolation. It became the conviction that something was fundamentally wrong with you, because surely if the world was as broken as you perceived it to be, someone else would be saying something. The silence of everyone around you felt like evidence of your own insanity rather than evidence of their unconsciousness. Jung was particularly concerned about this dynamic because he understood how dangerous it was to experience spiritual crisis without adequate support. The psyche in crisis needs mirroring. It needs someone to say, yes, what you're experiencing is real, and here's a framework for understanding it. Without that mirroring, the person in crisis has only two options: conclude they're insane and suppress their experience, or maintain their perception and accept total isolation. Most Indigo Empaths oscillated between both, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, suppressing their perception until it became unbearable, reasserting their perception until the isolation became unbearable. A brutal cycle that only breaks when they finally encounter a framework that validates what they've always known. The fourth sign is that authority without authenticity triggers something in you that goes beyond disagreement. It's visceral, physical. When you encounter a person or institution that holds power but lacks genuine integrity, something in your body revolts, not rebellion in the teenage sense, where you push back to establish identity. Something deeper, an almost cellular rejection of false authority that you've never been able to override, no matter how much you've tried. Jung described this as one of the most distinctive markers of this archetype. Most people have a functional relationship with authority. They can disagree internally while complying externally. They can recognize a system is flawed and still operate within it. They can see that a leader lacks integrity and still follow their directives. This capacity for strategic compliance is actually a healthy psychological adaptation. It allows people to navigate imperfect systems without constant conflict. The Indigo Empath lacks this capacity almost entirely, And Jung found this wasn't a choice or a character flaw. It was a structural feature of how this archetype processes authority. When the Indigo Empath's penetrative empathy perceives the gap between someone's claimed authority and their actual integrity, the archetype registers that gap as a fundamental violation, not a preference or an opinion, a violation. The same way your body registers a toxin, something that cannot be tolerated because tolerating it would poison the system. This has probably destroyed careers, relationships, and opportunities for you. You couldn't stay in the job where the manager was performing competence while operating from insecurity and control. You couldn't maintain the friendship with someone who positioned themselves as a mentor while unconsciously using you for narcissistic supply. You couldn't sit in the church, the classroom, the boardroom, where the authority figure's words contradicted the energy you perceived radiating from them. And every time you left, every time you couldn't force yourself to comply, people told you the same thing. You're too rigid, too idealistic. You'll never succeed if you can't learn to work within imperfect systems. But Jung saw something different. He saw that the Indigo Empath's rejection of inauthentic authority wasn't rigidity. It was an immune response. The archetype is designed to protect the integrity of consciousness itself. When it encounters authority that operates from shadow, from unacknowledged wounds, from unconscious power, drives disguised as leadership, it triggers a rejection response because allowing that authority to direct the Indigo Empath's energy would corrupt the very thing the archetype exists to protect: your perception, your clarity, your alignment with what's actually true. This is why Jung found that Indigo Empaths often had catastrophic relationships with institutions, schools, corporations, religious organizations, even therapeutic systems. Any structure that demanded compliance with authority the Indigo Empath could perceive was operating from shadow became intolerable, and the Indigo Empath would either leave voluntarily or be forced out after their inability to comply became disruptive enough to threaten the system's stability. The cost of this is enormous, and Jung didn't minimize it. Every rejection of inauthentic authority comes with a price: financial instability, professional setbacks, social isolation, the perception that you're impossible to work with, when in reality, you're impossible to deceive. And the accumulated cost over a lifetime creates a specific kind of exhaustion that people without this archetype can't comprehend. The fatigue of someone who has been punished repeatedly for possessing an integrity they never chose and cannot disable. But Jung also found that this same trait, when properly understood and directed, became the Indigo Empath's greatest source of power. Because the ability to instantly perceive the gap between performance and truth in authority figures is extraordinarily rare. Most people can't see it until the damage is done, until the corrupt leader has destroyed the organization, until the narcissistic partner has dismantled their sense of self, until the toxic system has consumed years of their life. The Indigo Empath sees it on contact, within minutes, sometimes within seconds. And that perception, when trusted rather than suppressed, becomes a navigational capacity that can save not just the empath, but everyone around them. The fifth sign, and this is the one Jung considered most psychologically significant, is that you carry a grief that doesn't belong to your personal history, a mourning for something you've never lost because you've never had it, a deep, persistent ache for a version of the world you can see with absolute clarity, but have never been able to touch. You know what authentic human connection looks like, even though you've rarely experienced it. You know what a healthy system feels like, even though you've never inhabited one. You carry a template for something beautiful and true, and the distance between that template and actual reality produces a grief so constant, it's become the background frequency of your existence. Jung found this to be the most confounding aspect of the archetype, both for the people who carried it and for the psychologists trying to treat them. Because this grief doesn't respond to normal therapeutic interventions, you can't process it as trauma because it isn't trauma. You can't treat it as depression because it isn't depression. You can't resolve it through grief work because you haven't lost anything specific. What you're mourning is an absence. The absence of the world your consciousness can envision, but your experience has never confirmed. Jung connected this to what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychic substrate that contains the accumulated wisdom and possibility of the entire human species. He theorized that certain individuals, those carrying specific archetypal configurations, had unusual access to this collective layer. They could perceive not just what is, but what could be. Not just how humans currently organize themselves, but how they're capable of organizing themselves. And this access to possibility, this vision of the potential that exists within the species, created a constant comparison between what's real and what's possible that registered as grief. You've probably been told you're too idealistic, that you need to accept reality as it is, that your expectations are unreasonable, and you've tried. God, you've tried. You've attempted to lower your standards, to accept mediocrity, to find peace with the world as it functions. But you can't, because the vision isn't a preference you can adjust. It's a perception you can't disable. You see what's possible with the same clarity that you see what currently exists. And the gap between those two perceptions is a wound that never fully closes. Jung emphasized that this grief, while painful, served a crucial function. It was the archetype's compass. The ache pointed toward what needed to change. The mourning encoded the blueprint for what could be built. The Indigo Empath's grief wasn't pathology. It was information. It was the psyche's way of saying, here is what's missing, here is what's needed, here is what you're meant to move toward, not to grieve forever, but to let the grief guide you toward the specific contribution your archetype exists to make. This is perhaps the hardest thing for people carrying this archetype to understand, that the grief isn't something to heal, it's something to follow, that the ache isn't a sign you're broken, it's a signal pointing toward the work you're here to do, not to fix the entire world, not to single-handedly close the gap between what is and what could be, but to bring even a fraction of the vision you carry into tangible reality, to build something, create something, protect something that reflects the template you hold inside. Jung observed that when Indigo Empaths finally understood this, when they stopped trying to cure the grief and started listening to what it was telling them, something shifted fundamentally. The grief didn't disappear, but it transformed from purposeless suffering into purposeful direction. The ache became fuel, the mourning became motivation. The vision that had always felt like a curse, showing them beauty they couldn't reach, became the very thing that guided them toward their authentic contribution. If you recognized yourself in all 5 of these signs, the mission that preceded experience, the empathy that penetrates rather than absorbs, the early spiritual crisis, the visceral rejection of inauthentic authority, and the grief for a world you can see but haven't found, then you carry what Jung mapped as one of the rarest archetypal configurations in human psychology. And that means your life has probably been marked by a particular kind of suffering that most people, even most empaths, will never understand. The suffering of someone who sees too clearly in a world that rewards comfortable blindness. But it also means you carry a capacity that the world desperately needs, the ability to perceive what's actually true beneath what's being performed, the refusal to participate in systems that sacrifice authenticity for stability, the vision of what's possible that persists even when current reality offers no evidence for it. These aren't flaws to be corrected. They're functions of an archetype that exists specifically because the collective needs individuals who can't be deceived, can't be pacified, and can't be convinced to stop seeing what they see. Jung would tell you this. Stop trying to make this archetype fit into a world that wasn't designed for it. Stop apologizing for the perception, the intensity, the refusal to comply with what your consciousness recognizes as false. The world didn't build structures to accommodate what you carry. That doesn't mean what you carry is wrong. It means the structures haven't caught up to the consciousness you represent. Your work isn't to shrink yourself into existing frameworks. Your work is to trust the archetype operating through you and let it guide you toward the specific corner of reality where your perception is needed, where your penetrative empathy reveals what's hidden, where your rejection of false authority protects what's genuine, where your grief for what could be becomes the blueprint for what you actually build. This archetype is rare for a reason. Not everyone is meant to carry it. The psychological cost is enormous. The isolation is real. The grief doesn't fully resolve, but the capacity it provides to see clearly, to refuse deception, to hold a vision of possibility that most people have forgotten, is irreplaceable. And if you've spent your life wondering why you couldn't just be normal, why you couldn't just accept things as they are, why the seeing never stopped, no matter how much you wished it would, now you know. You were never meant to stop seeing. You were meant to learn to use the sight. That's the rarest archetype, not the one that feels the most, the one that sees the most and refuses, despite everything, to look away. If you're feeling the weight of what you've just recognized in yourself, and you're ready to stop fighting the archetype and start working with it, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this moment. 24 practical reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, designed to help you map the inner landscape that's been demanding your attention your entire life. This is the work your archetype has been waiting for you to begin. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.